Hey guys, it's Jayden Clark here from Jazz Lesson Videos, and today we'll be diving into the benefits of using melodic cells in your improvisation. A melodic cell is a 4-note fragment that can be used to make up different phrases and patterns. I like to think of them as the unit between a single note and a phrase. For example, a melodic cell is made up of 4 notes, and a phrase can be made up of multiple cells. These cells can be diatonic, chromatic, or a mixture of both. By combining different cells, we are able to come up with and systematize different tensions and releases. For example, a chromatic cell can always resolve to a diatonic cell, or a diatonic cell can be shifted up a half step to create some more tension. Now, all of this is well and good, but one of the most common questions we get asked is, how do I apply any of this? To answer that question, we're going to check out 3 different etudes featuring each of the 3 types of melodic cells, that being diatonic, chromatic, and compound, or a combination of the 3. All of these etudes can be found in the Modern Etudes Melodic Cells PDF package, where you can find all of this language featured in choruses over common standards. To download this resource along with backing tracks, feel free to click the link below. Let's jump into this now with a melodic cell etude over Alone Together. Now, it's important to note that all 3 of these etudes we will cover will include a mixture of diatonic, chromatic, and compound cells, but we will focus on just one throughout each of them. This particular etude on Alone Together will highlight many different diatonic cells, and their movement can be easily analyzed. So let's go ahead and listen. So let's break down some of these sections. Okay, so the first 4 bars we can see clear diatonic cells. Now, I'm actually treating the whole measure to be a cell in this case. Of course, with the first measure starting on the 5th, right, on that offbeat there, followed by the 4th, and then the 5th again, goes down to the 3rd, the root, the 7, and then back to the root. So I'm considering that whole cell, that whole fragment, to be a melodic cell. It's very, very pentatonic-like. Now you can see in the next measure, this is measure 2, that exact same cell is taken and played down a half step, of course, with that first note being added where that 8th note rest was originally put in the first measure. Of course, this creates some nice tension because, of course, that doesn't fit with the E half diminished and the A7 add 9 chord. Then in measure 3 and measure 4, we change it up slightly. Now, the cell that I can see that is being transposed from measure to measure is actually the cell that's played on the first 2 beats of each measure, and you can see that we have 4, 1, 3, 5. And of course, that cell is shifted up a half step on the first 2 beats of the following bar. So you see how these different tensions and releases are being created just with these small fragments. Of course, if we skip to measures 7 and 8, we have another great example of a diatonic cell being shifted down in half steps to create tension. Of course, this cell is actually pretty easy to spot. Of course, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4 moving down at 2 half steps before not really resolving. Of course, one thing I want to note in between all of these different diatonic cells. Of course, like I mentioned, you're going to be able to see this through each of the etudes, but we have all of these chromatic cells that are placed in between, which often act as connectors, right? They help our voice leading. Now, in this particular etude, I like to look at measure 9 for that. You actually have 2 chromatic cells followed by a diatonic cell in measure 10. Now, speaking of chromatic cells, let's go ahead and check out this etude on Donna Lee that features a whole bunch of them. I want you to really listen for how they allow the phrases to deviate from the harmony and how they can connect each cell to the next. So in the first 3 measures, we can see a chromatic cell in each one of them. In the first measure, we can see our chromatic cell starting on beat 3. In the second measure, we can see our chromatic cell starting on beat 1, and note 4 of that cell deviates just slightly from the previous measure, otherwise the whole cell would simply be shifted down a half step. Measure 3 features a chromatic cell on beat 3, and this has a slightly different direction, plus it also features a different note on beat 4. Notice in particular the chromatic cells in measure 2 and measure 3, how they are leading to something else that is diatonic. This is allowing for good voice leading. Now, it's also interesting to note that measures 2 and measure 8, they are practically identical, right? Barring one note. Of course, they are being played over different chords, but the cell, the chromatic cell, and the pattern in general fits just nicely over both of them. Of course, we can also look towards measures 10, 11, and 12, and we can see that chromatic cell popping up again and again. In fact, the chromatic cell in measure 10, exactly the same cell that is being used in measure 1, just shifted down a few notes. Now, from 13 through until 16, you can see a lot of these diatonic cells coming back. Of course, in measure 13, we can see that 5, 6, 1, 2, or 9, if we want to think about it that way. And of course, this is being shifted down half steps, and then we see that same chromatic cell pop back up on beat 3 of measure 14, using it as like a connector, like we've seen in the previous etude as well. Of course, combining these two, right, the diatonic and the chromatic cell, we can create compound cells. Now, a great example of a compound cell would be in that measure 15. So that measure 15, of course, you see 3, 4, 5, 7, followed by that same chromatic cell. And when you pair them together, we can consider that to be a compound cell. Now, what you'll find is that certain cells will fall into your muscle memory much easier than others, and therefore you will find yourself using them more often. For chromatic cells in particular, there are only so many ways in which you can play them. To get deeper into this, you can find how these same cells are used in different combinations throughout the Modern Etudes Melodic Cells PDF package. What you'll also see throughout the package is an easy way to formulate that kind of variation, and that's with compound cells. This etude on confirmation will demonstrate how you can use a mixture of compound, diatonic, and chromatic cells to create more angular melodic phrases. It's important to note that compound cells don't always have to be made up of diatonic and chromatic cells. They can also be made up of 2 or more different diatonic cells or chromatic cells. Note that it is extremely rare to see a compound cell be deliberately made up of 3 or more melodic cells. So let's go ahead and take a listen to confirmation. So straight off the bat, we can see a compound cell, a repeated compound cell being used in measure 1 and 2. Of course, we can see this as being a chromatic cell starting on the 3rd. Of course, the 4th note of that cell is up on the 5th. And then we go back to the 3rd, and we go to 1, 2, 3. Of course, this whole compound cell is shifted down a half step in the next measure, completely disregarding any of the harmony in that measure. Now, measures 3 and 4 you can also consider to be compound cells. Of course, they're both different to each other. Of course, the 3rd measure there, you start with that chromatic cell, and then you have sort of, it goes just down the scale. So you got 9, 1, 7, 6. And of course, the 4th measure there, you have 3, 4, 5, 3, followed by a chromatic cell that starts on the root of that chord. Another interesting part of this particular etude is measures 7 and 8. Of course, you have these diatonic cells in measure 7. We're going 1, 2, 3, 5, and of course we're shifting that up a half step. Now in measure 8, right, we've shifted up a couple of half steps, and then we finish off the measure with a chromatic cell, making that measure a compound cell. This then shifts into the next measure, which also features diatonic cells moving up in half steps. So we are connecting the dots once again with this chromatic cell. Now let's look at measure 14 and 15. We've got a much shorter compound cell, or shorter, leaves out one note. And we have measure 14, we start on a chromatic cell, and then we land on the root and the 3rd of the next chord. And of course we then pick up into the next measure, and we play that exact same thing down a half step. Of course, notice the second last note of measure 15 that is resolving down to what looks to be a major 7, but really we are just outside of the harmony now. This is more of that tension that these cells are creating. By being familiar with the different ways in which we can apply diatonic, chromatic, and compound cells, we can more confidently use them to construct melodic phrases and have greater control of our use of tension and release. Knowing how and where to use these in tunes is a crucial stepping stone in being able to improvise more freely. To find more etudes like those we checked out in the video, go ahead and click the link below to download the Modern Etudes Melodic Cells PDF package. As always, please let us know if there are any particular topics that you would like us to cover in our next video, and we'll be sure to put them on the top of our list. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.